Why did the pilot just glance toward row 9, like he already knew her? Elena Matthews boarded flight 4827 like she had boarded hundreds of flights before, quietly, without fanfare, without leaving ripples in the stream of travelers flowing. Toward the aircraft, she had perfected the art of being invisible. No flashy luggage to announce her, no frantic search for her boarding pass, no eager smiles at strangers in the aisle. Her black backpack was small enough to tuck under the seat without a fight. Her worn Kindle carried in her hand like a shield. Against small talk, her appearance said everything she wanted it to say nothing. Brown hair tied into a loose bun that might have been done half asleep, no makeup, no jewelry, a faded gray hoodie that could belong to anyone, the kind of garment you couldn't date or place. And sneakers, comfortable, silent, forgettable. A flight attendant scanned her boarding pass, offered the kind of smile airline crews practiced in mirrors, and gestured toward the cabin. Elena nodded, murmured thanks, and stepped down the narrow aisle. She didn't glance at anyone's face. Didn't need to. The seat numbers came into view, and she slid into row 9 window seat, just as a young couple beside her argued in hushed, irritated tones over who would get the middle armrest. Perfect. Not too close to the cockpit, where she might be noticed by the crew. Not too far back, where escape routes narrowed and the noise was louder. Row 9 was strategic in ways most passengers never considered. Close enough to move forward quickly, far enough to avoid drawing the eye. She had chosen it deliberately, though even she wasn't sure why anymore. Habit, muscle memory from a life she'd buried. She stowed her bag, buckled her belt, and reached automatically for the laminated safety card in the seat pocket. She studied it with the kind of mild interest that would look casual to anyone watching, but her eyes traced the emergency exits and latch diagrams with genuine care. The cabin around her filled with the usual pre-flight noise, the zip of luggage compartments, the shuffling of coats, coughs, the occasional chime from a phone as passengers sent last messages before airplane mode. Somewhere a toddler began to cry, not a piercing wail, just the early stages of protest. Flight attendants moved like dancers, checking seat belts, adjusting overhead bins, delivering reminders with voices pitched to be heard over the drone of boarding. The man beside her, balding, middle-aged, smelling faintly of aftershave and cheap coffee, attempted a polite smile. His tie was crooked, his suit a little too shiny, like it had seen too many dry cleanings and not enough replacements. She returned a faint, polite smile of her own before sliding her earbuds into place and turning her attention to the window. The universal gesture of "not today, please" on the tarmac below. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency. The air was brisk for a Denver morning, but unusually clear. No haze. No low clouds threatening to delay departures. A perfect flying day. Yet, something unsettled her. She couldn't name it. Not fear. Not exactly. More like pressure. A faint tightening in her chest. The kind that wasn't physical, but instinctive. It was an echo from somewhere she didn't want to revisit. She pushed the feeling down, telling herself it was nothing. The engines roared to life, vibration rolling through the cabin floor and into her bones. She let the sound settle over her. There was something about the steady hum of a plane preparing for takeoff that she found not comforting, exactly, but familiar, like the sound of boots on a hangar floor. The plane taxied, the safety briefing playing overhead. The voice was calm, automated, distant. No one really listened, except her. She scanned the exits again, timing the seconds between the flight attendants' rehearsed movements. When the nose lifted and the ground fell away, Elena let her head rest back against the seat. Clouds slipped past the window like pale curtains, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky. The ascent was smooth, almost too smooth. She closed her eyes and tried to pretend she was just another passenger with nowhere urgent to be. It had been months since she'd flown commercially. She'd stuck to trains, buses, the occasional rental car. Easier that way. Cleaner. Safer. Not safer from danger. She'd faced worse on land. But safer from being found. In her old life, the sky had been freedom. Now, it felt like exposure. Her hand drifted to the armrest as she took a long breath. Row 9. She had asked for it specifically. She told herself it was for legroom, but deep down, she knew it was positioning. Old instincts didn't die. They just went quiet until they were called. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign clicked off, and the beverage cart began its slow roll down the aisle. Plastic cups clinked. Ice rattled. "Water, please," Elena said when the flight attendant reached her. She took the cup. The condensation slick against her fingers. Fingers that trembled. Slightly, she noticed it. Again, that strange tension in her body. Like the moment before a lightning strike, her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. Nothing unusual. The second jolt wasn't turbulence. It was calculated. It came just as the beverage cart had reached the middle of the cabin. A quick, sharp motion that made plastic cups jump in their holders and a few passengers gasp. Elena's water sloshed against the rim of its cup, cold droplets spotting her hoodie. She didn't flinch, but her eyes opened fully. She'd flown enough to recognize the difference between natural turbulence and something else. This was too precise, too sudden. Overhead, a faint metallic rattle joined the low hum of the engines as luggage bins quivered. The man beside her gave a forced chuckle. "Hope this isn't one of those flights." She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze moved to the oval window. Outside, the clouds had changed. They weren't the smooth, slow-moving shapes from earlier. Now they swirled in subtle, unnatural patterns, like ink in water. The forecast had promised clear skies all the way to New York. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reed's instincts tightened into a knot. He watched as the GPS display froze, then stuttered back to life. For a moment, everything looked normal again, but his experience told him that normal was sometimes just the calm before something broke. Then, on the secondary display, a small, pulsing triangle flashed into existence. Not a commercial aviation symbol, a military one, and only for a heartbeat before vanishing. Reed's jaw flexed. He didn't say anything. Not yet. In row 9, Elena spotted the overhead altitude display glitch, 35,000 feet. Then, in less than a second, it read 34,925, then jumped again minus 35,050, then back to 35,000. Most passengers wouldn't notice, but she had seen systems like this misread before in war zones, where enemy drones jammed electronics or cyber teams tried to pull an aircraft into hostile airspace without ever touching it physically. Her fingertips pressed into the armrest. The plane shuddered again. Not violently, not enough to spill drinks or scream about, but enough to make a mother in row 6 hold her toddler closer. Enough to send a small rolling water bottle drifting down the aisle. The fastened seatbelt sign glowed red above her. The flight attendant smiled through it, the way professionals did when their own hearts picked up pace. And then, the moment that cut through all the background noise. A voice crackled faintly over the aircraft's internal audio system, not the public address, not the smooth tones of a crew announcement, something buried in the internal channels, distorted by static. Just a handful of words. Falcon 2. Status. Copy. Elena's heart stopped. She knew that voice, even under the noise. She knew the cadence, the clipped efficiency, the way it fit the call sign like it had been rehearsed for years. The sound around her dulled. The murmurs of passengers, the whir of ventilation. Even the faint hum of the engines became a distant blur. She was back in a cockpit. Another time. Another aircraft. With that same voice in her ear, and the last time she'd heard it, smoke had been choking the air, alarms screaming, and her hands had been slick with sweat on the controls. She didn't look around. Didn't let her eyes betray what she'd heard. If no one else reacted, that meant no one else understood. Falcon 2. She had spent over a decade burying that name so deep it barely existed on paper anymore. Most records that contained it had been sealed, burned, or deleted. She had stopped answering to it long before she'd stopped flying. But some names, they aren't just names, they're triggers. Her breathing slowed. The taste of recycled cabin air felt sharper in her lungs. She leaned forward slightly, scanning the cabin without turning her head too much. No uniforms, no obvious agents, just passengers. A man in a navy sweatshirt scrolling through his phone. A young woman tapping out a message before airplane mode shut her off from the world. An older couple quietly sharing a crossword puzzle. Her eyes flicked toward the cockpit. If the voice had reached her through the plane's internal comms, it wasn't meant for the passengers. Someone up front had pushed it through, deliberately. And there was only one person who would ever call her that in the cockpit. Captain Reed's eyes darted to the comm panel. He'd spoken into the channel without looking at the co-pilot, who was now leaning back in his seat, rubbing at his temple like he'd developed a sudden headache. Reed didn't explain himself. He just waited, back in row 9, Elena's. Mind moved fast. Whoever was behind that signal, whether friend or threat, knew she was here, knew her seat, knew her history. That was no accident. Her fingers slid down toward her backpack, pulling it slightly closer under the seat. From its side pocket, she withdrew a small, sleek black case, the kind that didn't belong in the hands of a casual traveler. 3 inches long, matte finish, military issue. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she sat back, heart steadying, her gaze fixed on the cockpit door like it might open at any moment. The plane jolted once more, sharper now. The cart in the aisle slammed into a row of seats. A startled cry came from somewhere behind her. Flight attendants moved quickly. Voices calm, reassuring. Everything's fine, folks. Just a little rough air. It wasn't rough air. She knew it. A shadow passed over her thoughts, not fear. She was only a few feet from the cockpit, but the distance felt longer than any runway she had ever walked. Each step seemed to pull her deeper into a place she thought she'd left behind forever. The reinforced door loomed ahead, thick, industrial, its metal edges catching the cabin's fluorescent light. It wasn't just a barrier. It was a line between two worlds. Behind it, a sealed reality where chaos could be contained or unleashed without warning. A small, rectangular panel sat flush beside the doorframe. A black square of security tech no passenger should ever touch. Elena stopped in front of it, her hand hovering just above the surface. A faint buzz sounded from inside, followed by Captain Reed's voice. Low but steady. Voice ID confirmed. Open the panel. The magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy click. The door swung inward. The air inside the cockpit was different. Drier, sharper, filled with the faint ozone tang of overheated circuitry. Warning lights blinked in red and amber. A staccato heartbeat pulsing across the instrument panels. The subtle whine of strained electronics underscored the steady roar of the engines outside. Her eyes adjusted quickly, cataloging everything in seconds. The co-pilot slumped in his seat, head tilted awkwardly, oxygen mask dangling loose from the ceiling above him. A dark bruise had already begun to bloom across his temple. His chest rose and fell shallowly. Alive, for now. Captain Reed at the helm. One hand gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity, the other darting between navigation inputs he clearly didn't trust anymore. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing a line down to the edge of his jaw. The primary navigation display frozen, its digital map stuck in an incomplete refresh cycle. Beside it, the secondary system showed a course drift, subtle, but enough to pull them into airspace they had no clearance for, Elena, Reed said. And for a second, the wait. In his voice carried more history than urgency. Relief was there, yes, but also something unspoken, something heavier. Didn't think I'd have to call you back like this. She stepped inside, the cockpit door swinging shut behind her with a muted thud. You use the call sign, she said quietly. I wouldn't have unless it was bad. Her eyes swept the panels again. Autopilot indicators flash warnings. Auto navigation failure? Beneath that, digital override in progress. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge. Beneath it, what happened to him? She nodded toward the unconscious co-pilot. Felt dizzy, collapsed mid-climb. No history of medical issues. I think they targeted him. They, she repeated, locking eyes with him. A grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Whoever's hijacking us. They're smart. They're taking control in intervals, just enough to steer us without triggering full alarms. If I hadn't caught the drift, we'd already be halfway into restricted airspace. She didn't waste time with shock. How long? 17 minutes until we're out of AFA-controlled airspace. Once we cross the line, we're in a restricted zone near Allegheny. If we breach without clearance, F-18s will scramble. Her jaw tightened. They won't ask questions. They'll just engage. For a brief second. Their eyes held. Two people who had been in cockpits before, who understood that 17 minutes could be an eternity or nothing at all. She slid into the co-pilot's seat, her fingers moving before the rest of her body had even settled. The familiarity was eerie, as if her muscles had been waiting for this for years. She began running diagnostics through the secondary console, bypassing the civilian flight systems entirely. You remember the bypass protocol? Kilo 14? She asked. I remember writing it with you, Reed said. Her hands moved quickly over the controls, navigating through layers of encrypted systems that weren't supposed to exist on commercial aircraft. She found them anyway, somewhere buried in a Department of Defense archive. Falcon 2's credentials still existed, dormant, but alive. The panels responded to her inputs. Code scrolling in fast vertical lines, she ignored most of it, searching for the intrusion point. For a moment, the navigation system blinked. White, then green. Manual control restored. GPS routed back to primary. She announced. Reed let out a slow, measured breath. You did it. I slowed it down, she corrected. We haven't won yet. They'll try again. Who is? They? I have a guess, she said. But it's not going to matter if we don't land this plane. The comm panel crackled suddenly, pulling both their eyes toward it. This time, the voice wasn't encrypted. It was loud, official, and impossible to ignore. Flight 4827. This is Northeastern Defense. You are breaching restricted airspace. Divert immediately or prepare for military response. You have 60 seconds to comply. Reed's eyes went wide. We're already in the zone. I can turn us, Elena said. Her voice was calm, absolute. He didn't move. Just watched her take the controls. Her hands settled on the yoke with a steadiness that startled even her. It was muscle memory, pure and unshakable, flowing back into her as if no time had passed since the last time she'd flown under fire. Outside the cockpit, passengers had no idea how close they were to being a target. As she began easing the aircraft's nose away from the restricted zone, a memory intruded, sharp, unwanted, 15 years ago. She had been the youngest female test pilot in her Air Force division. Fast, fearless, trusted with missions no one else wanted. They gave her experimental craft with untested systems because she didn't just follow protocol. She anticipated. Her last mission had been one of those. A prototype aircraft, part drone, part fighter, with AI-assisted navigation years ahead of its time. She and Reed had been testing it together. Halfway through the flight, the AI malfunctioned, cutting them off from every networked system. The jet became a ghost, invisible. The cockpit was steady for the first time in almost 20 minutes. But Elena didn't let herself relax. When you've been in the air long enough, you learn the difference between a reprieve and a victory. This was only a reprieve. The screens glowed in muted greens now, stable readings replacing the chaotic red flickers from before. Autopilot remained disengaged, manual control in her hands. But she could feel it in the way the aircraft responded, a subtle drag in the yoke, an almost imperceptible delay between her inputs and the plane's reaction. "They're still in here," she murmured. Reed nodded grimly. "Like a parasite. They're not trying to shut us down anymore. They're trying to make us think we've won." Her eyes narrowed. Never assume a clean board means a clean system. She'd learned that the hard way, years ago, in training missions that simulated exactly this kind of attack. The instructors would lull you with silence, then slip in a deeper code strand you didn't notice until it was too late. She began running a deeper diagnostic through the co-pilot's console, the kind of military-grade system scan no civilian jet should be capable of. Her fingers moved quickly, pulling up layers of code most commercial pilots wouldn't even recognize. "Whoever's doing this isn't just military trained," she said. "They've had access to restricted architecture, the kind used for unmanned systems." Reed leaned forward. "So this isn't some hacker in a basement?" "No," she said flatly. "This is someone with resources. A team, back-end support, maybe even a full ops center." The plane hit a shallow patch of turbulence, the nose dipping slightly. Passengers wouldn't notice the subtle fight happening in the cockpit. To them, it was just air currents. But Elena's hands tightened on the yoke as she compensated, keeping the descent shallow and controlled Dot from behind the locked cockpit door. Muffled sounds filtered in. The restless shifting of passengers, the occasional raised voice, the steady knock of a flight attendant checking if they were still there. Reed ignored it. "We've still got 14 minutes before that airspace becomes irreversible." She glanced at the clock. "And every second, they're adjusting their strategy." The first counterstrike came quietly. No flashing alarms. No loud errors. Just a slow bleed. The altitude indicator began to drift, a few feet at a time, while the actual altimeter readings stayed the same. A lesser pilot would have trusted. "The wrong numbers. They're trying to blind us," she said. "Force us to rely on their feed." She switched to analog backup instruments, old mechanical dials and needles, the kind no amount of cyber manipulation could fake. Reed shot her a sideways glance. "I've missed flying with someone who doesn't get seduced by the glass. Screens." She almost smiled, almost thought the second counterstrike was bolder. Fuel readings began to drop faster than they should have. In an instant, she realized what they were doing, feeding false data to push them into making a premature landing. If they diverted too soon, the alternate routes would put them over remote stretches where help would be hours away. "They're hurting us," she said. Her fingers flew over the inputs, cutting the external data feed entirely. She rerouted the system to rely solely on internal sensors, slower to update, but honest. The fuel readings stabilized Dot in the cabin. The shift in flight path was noticeable. A baby began to cry. Voices rose, and the muted knock on the cockpit door turned into a firmer pounding. Reed picked up the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a minor technical issue up front. Nothing to be concerned about. Please remain seated with your belts fastened." His tone was steady, believable, but his knuckles were pale where they gripped the microphone. The third counterstrike hit harder. A sudden warning screamed across the panel. "Oxygen supply fault, cabin pressure drop." Reed stiffened, eyes darting to the environmental control system. Elena didn't look panicked. She looked suspicious. "They're bluffing." She accessed the raw pressure readings. Normal. Whoever was on the other side of this wasn't trying to kill them with this move, not yet. They wanted chaos. Oxygen masks would drop. Panic would spread, and the crew would lose control of the passengers. "Not on my watch," she muttered, isolating the environmental system before the signal could trigger the masks. Reed let out a breath. You're playing chess with them. No, she said. I'm playing chicken, and I'm not blinking first. She thought back to the day she and Reed had written the Keel 14 protocol. It had been during a Black Ops training exercise, simulating a worst-case scenario. A hijacked aircraft controlled remotely by hostile AI. The entire goal was to reclaim the aircraft without destroying it. Back then, they'd had time, backup, and ground command in their ears. Today, they had none of those things. Just 2 pilots, 1 unconscious co-pilot, a cabin full of civilians, and a shrinking clock. The memory steadied her. She wasn't a commercial passenger anymore. She was Falcon 2 again. 9 minutes. The navigation feed flickered. They'd try. Again soon, she could feel it. The code pulses were becoming more frequent, like a heartbeat speeding toward a sprint. They're pushing for a final override, she said. Reed straightened. If they get it, they won't. She reached into her backpack one more time, pulling out the small black case again. But this time, she removed a second drive, slimmer than the first. This wasn't the kill code. This was the ghost code. It was something she and Reed had. The cockpit was quiet. Too quiet. For a moment, Elena almost welcomed the silence after the kill code severed the remote intrusion. No alarms, no hostile pulses in the system, no flicker in the instruments. Just the steady hum of engines and the faint vibration of metal around them. But the quiet didn't last. A deep shudder rolled through the aircraft. So subtle at first, it could have been a pocket of air. Then it came again, heavier, dragging at the frame like something unseen had latched on. Elena's eyes snapped too. The engine output gauges, engine 2 was losing power. Reed, I see it. His voice was tight. But there was no panic. Panic was useless here. Within seconds, the second engine's thrust dropped another 5%. Fuel consumption spiked. Abnormally. The kind of bleed that made every pilot's skin go cold. They're not in the system anymore, Reed said. So this is mechanical. Not mechanical, Elena replied. Mechanical would fail on its own. This was triggered. She reached up, flipping the toggle for the internal engine diagnostics. The display scrolled through data in quick bursts, showing no actual damage to the turbine or fuel lines, which meant the problem wasn't physical. It was in the controls themselves. The last attack had left a scar. How long? Reed asked. At this rate? She glanced at the readouts. We've got maybe 20 minutes of power on 2, 40 on 1. If it holds. He adjusted their heading slightly, eyes flicking between the navigation screen and the analog backup map. Nearest runway? Elena scanned the options. Closest is a regional strip 50 miles east. Too far if we keep bleeding power like this. Next is... She stopped. Her finger landed on a thin green line on the chart. A military reserve base 30 miles west. Short runway, surrounded by forest. Reed's jaw tightened. Not designed for a jet this size. Better than crashing in the woods, she said. He didn't argue. She opened the COM channel to the tower frequency for the base. Static greeted her first, then a clipped voice. Unidentified civilian aircraft. You are in restricted airspace. State your intentions. This is Flight 4827, Elena said, her voice calm, precise. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate landing clearance at your facility. Engine 2 is failing. Fuel bleed confirmed. A pause. Then the voice returned. Less sharp now. Flight 4827. You're cleared for emergency landing. Be advised, runway length is 3,000 feet. Approach with caution. Copy, she said. Reed shot her a look. 3,000? I've landed on worse, she replied. And she had dirt strips in desert heat. Icy sheets in high-altitude outposts, but not in a 160,000-pound commercial jet with one engine fading. As they turned toward the base, she could feel the cabin. Behind them reacting to the change, The sound of engines shifting pitch was something passengers recognized instinctively, even if they didn't understand why. From behind the locked door came muffled voices, a ripple of whispers, a child crying, someone raising their voice to a flight attendant. Reed kept his eyes on the instruments. "You want to tell them?" "No," Elena said. "You keep them calm, I keep us alive." He didn't push it. The approach wasn't straightforward. The base was surrounded by dense forest, with only one narrow corridor to align with the runway and the weather. So, calm earlier had turned subtly against them. Clouds had thickened, flattening the light into a gray wash that made distance harder to judge. She dropped their altitude, watching the altimeter needle fall. The aircraft trembled slightly in the crosswind, and she corrected gently, refusing to oversteer. "Speed?" Reed asked. 230. "Dropping," she replied. The ground radar lit up with terrain markers as the forest canopy came into range. The base itself was a faint rectangular smear of gray in the distance, not much more than a strip of concrete carved out of the green. "Gear down," she said. The mechanical clunk reverberated through the fuselage as the landing gear extended. A second later, a vibration started in the nose wheel assembly. Not dangerous, but a reminder that nothing about this landing would be clean. In the cabin, oxygen masks had not dropped, but people were bracing themselves anyway. A woman in row 10 gripped her seatmate's hand so tightly their knuckles turned white. An elderly man in row 14 shut his eyes, mouthed something silently. A boy in the middle section leaned toward the window, trying to see through the low cloud cover. A flight attendant crouched in the aisle, speaking softly to a mother with 2 children, telling her to keep the seatbelts tight. The words were calm, but her own hands trembled slightly. None of them knew just how short the runway was. "Flaps 20, Elena said. Reed moved without hesitation, the lever clicking into place. The forest below rose toward them fast. She could see the tops of the trees now, swaying gently in the wind. The runway lights flickered faintly ahead, small, almost delicate against the expanse of green. "Too fast," Reed said. "I know," she replied. Her voice was flat, focused. She eased back on the throttles. Feeling the aircraft respond, engine 2 coughed once, the power dropping another 3%. "You've got one shot," Reed said. "That's all I need." The final approach corridor narrowed. The edges of the runway grew clearer now, cracked asphalt in some places, with grass pushing through, not exactly welcoming for a jet that could crush it in seconds. She adjusted their descent angle, aligning perfectly with the centerline. In her peripheral vision, she saw the base's emergency crews gathered along the edges, fire trucks, ambulances, and a handful of figures in dark uniforms. The altimeter ticked down. 500 feet, 403. "Reverse thrust ready," she said. Reed's hand hovered over the control. "Say when." The tires hit with a jar. Relief is never quiet. The moment the plane stopped, the cabin exploded into a chaotic blend of voices. Gasps turning to cheers, cheers turning into cries. Passengers hugged each other, clutched armrests, pressed trembling hands over their mouths. Someone near the back actually applauded. Others joined in, the sound awkward but genuine. Elena stayed in the cockpit, hands still on the yoke for several seconds after the engines wound down. She didn't move until she felt her heartbeat slow from a hard, fast pound to something steadier. Only then did she let herself lean back. Her muscles ached from the constant micro-adjustments of the landing, but she didn't notice the pain so much as the sudden absence of tension. The kind of absence that made you realize how close you'd been to disaster. Reed sat beside her, pale but upright, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He exhaled, long and slow. "Hell of a landing." She didn't look at him. "We're not done yet." Through the cockpit windows, the runway was alive with movement. Military emergency crews approached at a measured pace, their vehicles fanning out to secure the area. Fire trucks idled at the edges, foam cannons ready in case the brakes overheated or the landing gear failed. Medics hustled toward the aircraft's midsection with stretchers. But what caught Elena's eye wasn't the responders. It was the line of dark uniformed figures moving in a purposeful formation toward the rear of the plane. "They're going for him," she murmured. Reed followed her gaze. "Celine," she nodded. "Do you think they're here to protect him or take him?" "That's the problem," she said. "I don't know, and I'm not sticking around to find out." From the cabin came the sound of movement. Seatbelts clicking open. People standing too soon despite the crew's calls to remain seated. Flight attendants tried to hold them back, but adrenaline made passengers restless. One attendant's voice floated toward the cockpit. "Please remain in your seats until instructed to deplane. We will be exiting in an orderly." Her words were drowned out by someone further back shouting, "I'm getting off this plane now." The murmur spread. Elena reached down and zipped her black backpack. "If I stay, I'm going to be pulled into whatever mess Salin's in. If I go now, I have a chance of disappearing before anyone thinks to stop me." Reed studied her. "You're just going to walk away?" "I didn't come here to be the story," she said simply. "You already are." She gave him a thin smile. "Not if I can help it." She cracked the cockpit door just enough to step into the narrow galley. The air out here felt warmer, heavier, the scent of scorched rubber from the brakes filtering in from outside. Passengers craned their necks as she emerged, their whispers rising immediately. "That's her. She was in the cockpit. She landed us." She kept her gaze forward, ignoring the eyes. Her hoodie was up again, shadowing her face, her steps deliberate but unhurried. She moved past the forward rows and slipped into the midsection of the cabin. The aisle was partially blocked by passengers retrieving bags from the overhead bins despite the attendants' protests. A young woman in row 10 was clutching a small notebook to her chest, her eyes wide and fixed on Elena. As Elena passed, the woman hesitated, then reached down and pulled something from her seat pocket. It was a folded piece of paper. "You dropped this," she said softly. Elena stopped, glanced at it, then realized it wasn't hers. Not physically, anyway. She took it, unfolding it briefly as she walked. In neat, compact handwriting, it read, "Never forget who you really are. F2, a feint." Crease touched the corner of Elena's mouth. She folded it again and slid it into her hoodie pocket without a word. At the rear of the plane, things were different. The mood here was tense, hushed. Gregory Saline was still in his seat, but two men in dark tactical jackets stood just a few feet away. Their posture was relaxed, but not casual. They wore no clear insignia, no unit patches, no agency IDs. One of them leaned down and murmured something to Celine. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders tightened slightly. Elena slowed as she neared them. Slipping between a pair of passengers who were still gathering their belongings, she let the press of people shield her from direct view. She didn't speak to Celine, didn't try to intervene. That would draw attention she couldn't afford. Instead, she kept moving, angling toward the aft service door where a flight attendant was stationed. The attendant blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, we're not deploying from the back." "I know," Elena said, her voice low. "Crew access only, right?" The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the uniformed figures at the rear. Then she stepped aside. The moment the door opened, cool air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet tarmac and jet fuel. The ground was slick from a light rain and beyond. The immediate bustle of responders. The base itself was a cluster of low gray buildings against the tree line. No one looked at her twice as she stepped down the narrow stairs. Her sneakers hit the ground with a muted thud. She adjusted her hood, tightened the strap of her backpack, and began walking toward the far edge of the runway where the emergency vehicles thinned out. Mist hung low over the service road outside the base, clinging to her hoodie and beating on her eyelashes. It softened the edges of everything. The chain-link fence, the squat gray buildings, even the dark shapes of the forest beyond. But nothing. Felt soft. The air was cold in her lungs, sharp enough to sting. Each breath reminded her she was still alive, but also that she was still moving. Still inside the window of danger. She couldn't stop. Not here. Not now. Her sneakers whispered against the wet gravel as she walked. Head down, pace steady but not hurried. Hurry drew eyes. Steady vanished into background noise. She passed a rusted maintenance truck parked near the edge of the lot. A man in overalls leaned against its fender, cigarette glowing between his fingers. He looked at her once, the way you might look at a stranger on the street. Casual, uninterested. She nodded slightly. He nodded back. 2 steps later, she was gone from his awareness entirely. The base behind her was still a hive of activity. Even from here, she could hear the faint pulse of radios, the metallic clank of tools on the tarmac, the low, droning hum of the auxiliary power unit feeding the aircraft she had just landed. Somewhere in that bustle, military personnel would be trying to make sense of what had happened. Passengers would be interviewed. Salin would be taken. Somewhere, to safety, maybe, or to silence. She didn't know. And she couldn't stay to find out. Her phone vibrated in her hoodie pocket. It wasn't supposed to. She'd disabled every network link before boarding, every traceable signal. But the vibration was real, insistent. She slid it out, thumb hovering over the screen before she even looked. The display lit up. No number. Just a message. We saw. We're watching. Stay safe. Falcon 2. Her pulse ticked up, but only slightly. She stared at the words, reading them twice. Then she powered the phone off, removed the back, and dropped the battery into a nearby drainage grate. The phone itself went into a dumpster behind a supply shed. If they wanted to watch her, they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way. The mist grew thicker as she moved toward the tree line. The sound of her footsteps muffled now. Every so often she glanced over her shoulder. Not because she thought she'd see someone following. Anyone trained well enough to tail her wouldn't be visible. But because the act of checking kept her mind sharp. She reached a small service gate in the fence, its chain held closed. With a battered padlock, her fingers worked at the lock out of habit more than necessity. 3 seconds with a flat strip of metal from her pack. And it clicked open. Beyond the fence, a narrow path wound into the forest. She stepped through, closing the lock behind her. In the woods, the light dimmed further. Drops of water slid from branches overhead, landing cold against her skin. The earth was soft here, her steps barely audible. The air smelled of pine, damp soil, and the faint metallic tang of the base she'd left behind. As she walked, her thoughts were not on the landing, or even on the hijack. They were on the why Salin's name wasn't coincidence. The kind of intrusion she'd faced in the cockpit wasn't something that happened to random flights. Whoever had sent that code, whoever had gotten into a commercial aircraft systems with military precision, they had known she would be here. That meant she'd been compromised, not in the obvious ways. She'd kept her name buried, her history scattered, her trail cold. But someone had still found her. Someone with enough resources to force her back into the air after 15 years of silence. And enough interest to remind her, through Reed's voice, that she wasn't just Elena Matthews anymore. She was Falcon 2. A flash of her last mission came back. Not the crash, not the fire, not even the 72 hours of crawling through the snow with fractured ribs. It was the moment before takeoff, standing on the tarmac with the sun rising behind the hangar. Reed had been there. They hadn't spoken much, but she remembered the way he'd looked at her, like they both knew. The mission was going to end in a choice neither of them wanted to make. That was the last day she'd felt completely in control of her life. Until today, and today had been stolen from her before she even boarded the plane. The path through the woods sloped downward toward a rural access road. From there, she could vanish in a dozen directions, hitch a ride with a trucker, cut through to a rail yard, or simply walk until she found a place where no one would think to look. But as she approached the edge of the trees, she heard the distant thrum of rotors. She froze. Helicopters, more than one. They weren't flying high. The sound was too loud. Too close, she scanned the pale slice of sky visible through the branches, catching the flicker of movement between the trees. Black, military paint, no visible markings. She stayed still until the sound moved past, fading toward the base. Then she stepped onto the road. A pickup truck approached from the east, old, dented, its bed piled with firewood. The driver was a man in his 60s, ball cap pulled low, cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. He slowed when he saw her. "You from that plane?" he asked through the open window. She shook her head. "Just passing through." He studied her for a second longer, then jerked his chin toward the passenger door. "Road's long. Hop in if you're headed west." She hesitated, then climbed. In, the cab smelled faintly of tobacco and sawdust. They drove in silence for several miles. As the base disappeared behind them, she leaned back in the seat, pulling the folded note from her pocket once more. "Never forget who you really are." She stared at the words until they blurred slightly in her vision. Then she refolded it with care and tucked it deep into her backpack. Alongside the Ghost Code drive she hadn't returned to read. Some tools you didn't give back when they reached. A crossroads, the driver slowed. "Town's that way," he said, pointing right. "Nothing but woods and back roads if you go left." She pointed left. He nodded, turned the wheel, and never asked why. They passed no other vehicles for the next 20 minutes. The road